All right, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. And in this video, we consider some additional personality factors that psychologists will tell us will have a significant impact on our work life and in leading employees, some factors that we didn't consider in the first video on personality factors a couple of videos ago. So let's get started. I want to start this discussion on personality with a question that we didn't deal with in the first video, and that is the textbook definition of personality is essentially, as you see on the screen, the relatively stable set of psychological and behavioral attributes that distinguish one person from another. And what I want to pose for you is an alternate or an additional definition, or at least a way of understanding personality that may be helpful and informative for us to consider as we look at these other additional personality factors. And you see there on the screen, this second definition or description that I'm proposing for our consideration today. Is personality really that first stable set of behavioral and psychological attributes, or might we describe personality as a matrix of habitual behavioral patterns that flow from closely held meta-narrative and personal worldview? Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, so let's see if we can break that down for you. When we talk about a matrix of habitual behavioral patterns, what we're really trying to describe is a way, a pattern, a habit of responding to particular sets of circumstances and stimuli and emotions that we've developed over time. Perhaps they started when we were little children, and it would continue to be reinforced throughout our life to now it becomes just a knee-jerk habitual way that we respond to particular types of stimuli. If we are angry, if we are surprised, if we are in fear, that a whole set of habitual behavioral patterns come out. And it's a whole matrix interlaced, and together they form a very habitual pattern. Where do those patterns flow from? Well, I might suggest that a lot of those patterns flow from, as you see from the description, a closely held meta-narrative. Now, let's talk about that for a moment. What do we mean by meta-narrative? Well, narrative, as you know, simply means a story, a plot line. And meta is a Greek description that refers to something large, like a large amount of data is called metadata, right? Well, when we talk about a meta-narrative, what we're really describing is the big story, the huge, oversweeping, comprehensive narrative or story that we have in our head and our heart that explains to us why the world works the way that it does. Why did things begin the way they did? What do we really have to expect in this life from yesterday to today till tomorrow? What is the big long story that we have in our heads that forms this narrative on how life is supposed to work? The second element that informs this matrix of habitual behavioral patterns is our personal worldview, how we view the world, how we view the people in it, our relationships with others, and what we expect. Now, along those lines, we might describe instances of anger as a very indicative response to a violation of our worldview or meta-narrative. Let me give you an example, a quick example. Many of us, we understand that the character that is lauded in our behavior is for us to remain cool and polite even under pressure. And therefore we understand, especially in work settings, in work or with other groups, that there are some times where reacting with anger is really socially unacceptable. In other words, it's really uncool. And yet, there are still stimuli that we encounter in our lives that take us out of that polite realm of how we know we're supposed to respond. And rather than that, anger peaks out, sometimes uncontrollable anger. And just think of the last time this thing happened to you. Perhaps it was because you were driving along to work or to school or to some appointment and just blithely driving along and somebody cuts you off on the freeway. And for many of us, that is the stimuli that pulls out from us, or even past our normal restraints, pulls out from us this kind of anger, this kind of, if I had a rocket launcher, there'd be one less car on the freeway. Doesn't that guy know why does he drive? And what I would tell you is, suggest to you this, is that right there is a great example of your worldview and meta-narrative being violated. And because of that, it comes forth with a response of anger. What do we mean by that? Well, in that particular example, there is a part of the story you tell yourself about fairness and equity and your story revolving around you that says, I have a right, it is fair, it is equitable for me to be able to drive on the freeway without someone cutting me off. And when someone does that, they deserve the worst of my anger. Doesn't that person know who I am? Who is that person to drive in such a way as to treat me unfairly and violate my rights as a driver on this California freeway? Well, I would tell you, of course, if you're one of those types of people, and occasionally like me, right, that somebody cuts you off on the freeway and you get angry, well, I would suggest a couple of things. One, that's a direct peek, an unfiltered look into what your worldview and meta-narrative describe in terms of you, your rights, and your role in society and the universe. But I would also tell you that this is a perfect opportunity for you to expand your meta-narrative and worldview to encompass other possibilities. It is remotely possible that the driver who just cut you off doesn't even realize that he cut you off. It is quite possible that the reason that guy or that gal is driving like a maniac is because he or she has been unemployed for 8 months, has been having real trouble trying to provide for his or her family, and is on their way to their very first job interview that they've had in 8 months. That's why they're rushing. They could be rushing and driving like a maniac because they're on the way to the hospital because they just got a call from their doctor about the condition of a loved one. Or they could just be a jerk. And the point is, you don't know. And it doesn't cost you anything to mentally grant a little grace to this person because you don't really know what their situation is, and to arrive 1 car length later than you planned to. But I would tell you additionally, as future leaders of women and men in your career, in your work life, that when someone you are leading, one of your peeps, one of your staff that you are managing, displays this kind of uncontrollable anger, this uncool anger at the workplace, you have a direct view into their heart. You are able to see what is it that they hold so dear that they are willing to break social convention and show anger when that thing is violated, when that thing is threatened. Okay, so just something to keep in mind as we look at this whole topic of personality. Now, as you can see on the slide, a couple of other personality traits that we consider for those who we manage and lead. You can see there the first one, what we call the locus of control, which we define as the extent to which people believe that their behavior has a real effect on what happens to them. Do people really believe that they have the power to affect their environment and that things they do or choose not to do will have a real effect on what happens to them in the short term and the long term? You may know some people. You may know that gal or that guy that when something bad happens, they always blame someone else. Well, quite frankly, I would rather have dental work than have to work closely with someone like that, who's always blaming others for the things that go wrong, rather than understanding at some level there is locus of control. You have control over a large degree of your personal outcomes. Will you take responsibility and accountability for that? And as you can see, that's very tightly tied to the idea of self-efficacy, the second trait there on the slide, and that would be a person's belief about his or her capabilities to perform a task. And this is something you may encounter with employees that you promote or that you elevate to a higher role with greater responsibilities, that there may be a little bit of trepidation and fear and anxiety revolving around, my gosh, I really like this new title, I certainly like the larger paycheck, but if I'm honest with myself, I'm kind of wondering, do I have the skills, do I have the talent, do I have the chops to pull off this new role? And that, of course, is where, as a leader, you need to be able to come alongside and recognize that and be able to encourage that employee, that person, and say, look, I wouldn't have promoted you if I didn't have full faith that you had everything necessary to pull this job off. So we're going to work on this together. We're in this together. I'm here to make sure that you are successful, to build up a person's self-efficacy. So those are two, as you can tell, two rather tightly related personality traits, locus of control and self-efficacy. Here are two others that are tightly tied to the idea, the concept of power. The first is authoritarianism, which the textbook, at least in this context, will define as the extent to which a person believes that power and status differences are appropriate within hierarchical social systems such as organizations. Now, this is an interesting topic. And of course, we do have to say that we are restricting our discussion on authoritarianism to the definition given to us in the textbook, at least in this lecture. And so what you will find is that some folks, sometimes this is rather tightly bound to culture, the extent to which a person believes that it's appropriate for there to be very large differences in power and status between the boss and the staff, or between the CEO and the line employee. And you'll notice that someone who's very comfortable with large power and status differences oftentimes will naturally be relatively deferential to folks who are higher in the power structure, whereas others will seek to dissolve those kinds of power and status differences by trying to treat people on a flatter or a more equal playing scale where it may or may not be appropriate. So that's authoritarianism. The second, tightly related to power, you see the second trait there, Machiavellianism, which is described as used to describe behavior directed at gaining power and controlling the behavior of others. Now, where does that term Machiavellianism come from? It comes from a very old book written by the Italian author Niccolo Machiavelli called The Prince, and it was a treatise on a long essay on using political influence and power to manipulate people and get your way. It is quite over the top. It is so over the top that from time to time some people have come away from The Prince by Machiavelli and thought this has to be satire. It's so over the top. We are however, the majority opinion is that no, Machiavelli really was preaching that level of manipulation of others using power and influence. And nevertheless, however you feel about the book, what it really describes is how comfortable are people in your midst trying to wield influence and power to get their way and manipulate others. You see these two traits sometimes tightly wound together, authoritarianism and Machiavellianism. Moving on, other personality traits at work, we see here the traits of self-esteem and risk propensity. Self-esteem, defined by the textbook as the extent to which a person believes that he or she is a worthwhile and deserving individual, whereas risk propensity is defined as the degree to which a person is willing to take chances and make risky decisions. Now, you can sort of see how these two traits are tightly tied together. Someone with relatively high self-esteem, which ends up resulting in higher levels of self-confidence and feeling that they are worthwhile, will be able to separate their own personal worth from perhaps the risk or the percentage chances of failure as a result of making a risky decision. They would be more willing to make the risky decision because their own personal worth isn't threatened if things don't work out, if they have to clean up the mess afterwards. Whereas someone with relatively low self-esteem, relative to the first person we're talking about, may in and of themselves, because of that low self-esteem, low confidence, trusting oneself less, may be less willing to take chances and make risky decisions because a potential failure would be an indictment on them as a person and their worth, not simply an indictment on perhaps the wisdom of a particular external decision. I hope that makes sense. You can see how these things are given to us in pairs because there is a great deal of domain overlap when we consider these personality traits. Now, all of this is bound up together because these are things that we seek to recognize in ourselves and recognize in others, especially as we lead and manage them. You will need to approach people, for instance, with very, very low levels of self-esteem. You will need to manage and lead them in ways that are different, perhaps significantly different, than those people you lead and manage who have relatively high degrees of self-esteem. As well as folks who are not comfortable at all with power differences. If they have them on your staff, you may end up needing to build a work relationship with them, an interpersonal relationship in a way that is somewhat different than those who are very, very comfortable with power and status differences between those in authority and those that who they lead and manage. As you can sort of understand, these are things that really do intersect the domain of us leading and managing other people. All of this comes together then, you see in the slide in front of you, with what the textbook describes as an attitude structure, a structure that is made up of at least 4 components. Cognition, the knowledge a person presumes to have about something, right? You realize the way that that's worded, it doesn't necessarily mean the person really does have knowledge. It simply means they presume they have knowledge about something. Their affect, or how they feel towards something. Their intention, the intention or the trajectory or the attitude that guides a person's behavior, what they intend to accomplish, what they intend to see. And then the 4th element there, you can see if we have cognition at the top, at the bottom we have cognitive dissonance. And that happens when 2 sets of cognitions or perceptions are contradictory or incongruent. Perhaps someone has very deep feelings and deep sets of perceptions about a person, a leader in their environment. And when behavior is contradictory or not congruent with that previous belief, interesting things can happen in one's selective perception and these kinds of things. So, together, this attitude structure, which the textbook will tell us is constructed of cognition, affect, intention, and cognitive dissonance, they work together to comprise your staff person's attitudes, a person's beliefs and feelings about specific ideas, situations, or people. And that can lead to a higher or lower degree of job satisfaction, which is defined by the text as a degree of enjoyment that people derive from performing their jobs. All these things together, their attitude and their job satisfaction, the level of job satisfaction, can lead over time to an employee's organizational commitment, the level of an individual's identification with the organization and its mission. Now, starting at the bottom, you can see their organizational commitment can be ascertained simply if you listen to someone's conversation. Do they refer to them and the organization as we and us, or do they refer to the organization as you and them? That immediately exposes and betrays the level of internal identification that an employee may have with their company. If you've got someone who's been working there for 20 years, who's always referred to the company as we and us, and all of a sudden starts referring to the company as you and them, it's quite likely that person may have mentally made a move on to another employer, if you know what I'm talking about. So, job satisfaction, the degree of enjoyment that people derive from performing their jobs, that comes from a whole bunch of stuff. We'll talk about that when we talk about the topic of motivation in a following lecture. But there is a great deal of job satisfaction, which starts with the attitude that people bring to work first thing in the morning. All right, working our way sort of up this slide. a person's beliefs, feelings, and specific ideas about situations, about people. Yeah, the attitude that people bring in, which, as you can tell from the previous slide, is made up of at least 4 elements, right? That is going to lead to a predisposition about their job satisfaction just to begin with. We'll talk, as I mentioned, more about that when we hit the topic of different types of internal and external motivation coming in a future lecture. So, for the sake of this particular short lecture video, if you consider everything we've talked about here, about different personality traits like the locus of control and self-efficacy, with their comfort with power and how they wield whatever power and influence they have, all those kinds of things. Again, I want to finish up this lecture asking the same question we started out with. Do we believe that personality is the relatively stable set of psychological and behavioral attributes that distinguish one person from another? Or do we believe that personality is informed or can be described as a matrix of habitual behavioral patterns that flow from a closely held meta-narrative and personal worldview? Or quite frankly, do we have to even choose? Is a little of both? Well, I'll leave those conclusions to your own contemplation. Perhaps we can think about that and even talk about that in a written assignment coming soon. But for now, I want to leave you in this lecture with at least one last thing to contemplate, which is these are all considerations that we need to keep in mind as we think about leading others. Because you're not leading resources, you're leading people. And leading people means, as I've mentioned before in class lectures several times, in its essence, leadership is not simply about being in charge. That can lead to simply a power trip. But that's not what leadership is about. Leadership is not about being in charge. Leadership is about committing to look after those who are in your charge. It is a duty and a responsibility, perhaps the highest of duties and responsibilities, to commit to look after those who are in your charge for their benefit, for the benefit of the organization, for your future benefit. I hope you'll keep those things in mind. Hope that you've learned something about these additional personality factors to consider, and we'll see you in the next lecture.